Russian President Vladimir Putin held his annual press conference on Thursday, fielding a range of questions from geopolitical concerns to tracking cows. This was Putin's 13th press conference. What were the main highlights from the 4-hour-long event? Did any questions fluster the president's aura of inscrutability? Did he set out his presidential campaign? To answer these questions and more, we have Mr. Cui Hongjian, a researcher on European studies with the China Institute of International Studies, and Mr. Rick Dunham, a visiting scholar at Tsinghua University. We will also speak to Fred Weir, a journalist, Russian observer and a political analyst based in Russia. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Pan Dong. Before we get started, let's take a look at this.
13 is seen as an unlucky number in the Russian culture. But during his 13th annual press conference, Russian President Vladimir Putin appeared confident that the core of the DPRK nuclear issue is with the United States.
We've heard from the United States that they are going to stop military exercises, but they changed their mind. They conduct military exercises and the DPRK launches another missile, so on and so forth. This pattern should be stopped.
Putin went on to say he hoped relations between Moscow and Washington would normalize soon, but dismissed allegations of collusion between the Trump campaign and Russian officials during the 2016 U.S. presidential election.
This is world practice for the diplomats, for even government members to meet every candidate and every team.
The press conference was held just months before Russia holds presidential election. Most of the questions that Putin answered were from regional journalists, but he also faced the grilling by some of the few opposition media in Russia.
It was clear that he's sending his opponents a signal. Look, guys, one thing is just go to the streets and shout that we are fed up with President Putin, and another thing is to go to grassroots work.
During a press conference, Putin announced he would be running as an independent candidate in next year's election, but didn't give out too many details of his campaign. Every December, hundreds of journalists gather in Moscow for a chance to quiz the Russian president. Most of the questions are focused on domestic issues. However, in the several hours the press conference lasts, major international issues are also raised. Julia Lyubova, CGTN, Moscow.
So, gentlemen, let's get a discussion started. And this time it's a little bit different from previous marathon press conference sessions held by President Vladimir Putin. Now he's also an independent candidate running for the upcoming presidential election in Russia. How will this kind of double identity add momentum to this year's press conference, Mr. Cui?
Yeah, I think yes, I think the similarity of this conference of the previous year is long enough. But I think that it's also that less and less attractiveness to the outside, especially to the media. I think that not only because of the we have to realize that Russia not only on the focus, for the media, for the public concern. And I think, of course, another issue is how about Mr. Putin's election, because there is also less uncertainties about his
so you think
new term.
It's almost for sure that he will be the next president?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, of course, because so far I didn't find any negative impact or any kind of oppositive force to Mr. Putin to get another term as the president.
Mr. Dunham, President Putin didn't set out his election platform or anything related to his upcoming campaign for the next presidential election. Do you think, why do you think is this setting?
Well, this was a little different than most of the press conferences in the past. He shows that this is a marathon and he can handle the race. He can answer every question. But two things look different. One is he didn't seem to be enjoying the fight as much as he usually does. He usually really looks energetic about the give and take. He looked a little bit tired sometimes. His face was a bit red.
But are you saying that fighting is still there?
Definitely. He likes the combat of debate in the public sphere, and he likes attacking his enemies, domestic and foreign.
And what do you make of the questions? Do you think the questions this year are almost the same as...
I actually don't think that it was very different, because it had a range. He took questions from foreign press, from the United States, from Ukraine. He took questions from the opposition press in Russia, including one editor whose throat was cut a couple of months ago, and also another woman who was running for president against him. But his re-election is certain. All of his serious opposition either has been disqualified or is dead, and so there's really no serious opposition. He did not lay out an agenda, but it was the outlines of the agenda were there, because he talked about the growth under his leadership. Yes, he promised to double the GDP in 10 years, and it's only gone up 75% in 15 years. But that's not terrible in the overall scheme of things. That is an accomplishment.
Mr. Choi believes that Vladimir Putin will for sure be elected as Russia's next president. So many are saying that economic transformation will still be his biggest challenge in his domestic agenda. So from this Times press conference, do you have a clear idea that how will Mr. Putin tackle this problem in his upcoming term?
It was continuity, more of the same. He really was not specific. There was no big domestic initiative that he announced. It was, stick with me, I'm getting things done, I know how to do it. And he has widespread public support, so I don't think that anything that he said will cause him any kind of heartburn, any kind of political backlash.
What about energy, Mr. Choi? Do you think Russia's economy will still be heavily reliant on its energy sector?
Yes, so far I think that it's a bigger problem now for Russian economy to, transfer from energy, reliant structure to a new structure. But we can also find the efforts from Russian government and also Mr. Putin to try to transform this previous economic structure. Also, that's the reason why once you ask the question for the Russian economy, if there is not very, very good, express of this economy, of course, Mr. Putin will say that, okay, it's not my problem, it's because of the international market, because of the drop of the energy price and so on. But yes, I do believe that it's still, a target for Russia and Mr. Putin's government to transform this energy, structure to a more comprehensive economic structure. Otherwise, we cannot find the future for the Russian economy.
But it looks like Russia is still looking for a way out for its energy sector. Not long before this press conference, Russia launched its Yamal liquefied natural gas project in Siberia. It was co-constructed by Russia, China and France, and the shipping lane is quite interesting. It will use the northern Arctic route to transport liquefied natural gas to Europe and Russia, and cutting shipping time by at most 15 days. What does this tell about China and Russia's cooperation, both economically and strategically?
Yes, I think firstly we should try to point out a kind of a dilemma for Russian economy. Even Mr. Putin and his government want to try to transform this economic structure from energy reliant to maybe a comprehensive one. But so far, still, Russia and its economy need to get some more, finance, get more money from this energy industry. And of course, another issue is how about this China-Russia cooperation on energy. I think that so far, still, Russia is the biggest, energy provider to China. And also, between two countries, we have already very, a network of energy supply, and between two countries, and it goes through Central Asia and some other routes. But of course, at the same time, I think for China and Russia, we're also trying to find a new way to help Russia to set up a comprehensive economic structure. For example, in those 2 years, that China become a very, very big trader to Russia on electronic products, and also China imported a lot of agricultural products from Russia. I think all of these cooperation between two countries will give a very, very big help for Russia's economy to transform from energy relied to a comprehensive one.
Well, Mr. Dunham, at the press conference, President Putin also spoke highly of the 19th National Congress of the CPC in October and this bilateral ties between China and Russia. Do you think he's absolutely positive about the future development of ties between two countries?
Politically, definitely. It's crucial for Putin to have strong political ties with China, and that's important for economic reasons, for what you were just talking about the Northern Passage for goods. That's important for China and for Russia. Also politically, he would be isolated in the world if it wasn't for China. China really does bring him a strategic alliance that's very important, other than having a veto at the United Nations. And economically, there are some challenges for the two countries. Number one is Russia's dependence on energy and lack of diversity of its economy. The second is that the Belt and Road Initiative is going to, without any doubt, cause some sort of friction in Central Asia, where Putin sees for Russia's economic growth, he needs to export more, he needs to have closer ties, and the Belt and Road Initiative is going to go right through the heart of the former Soviet Union in Central Asia. So I think that's a challenge ahead. So it's vital for him right now to maintain good political ties for the friction that is inevitable as China continues to grow with the Belt and Road Initiative.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. We'll be getting back to you right after this. You're watching Dialogue on CGTN. Stay with us. You're watching Dialogue on CGTN. We are talking about Russian President Vladimir Putin's annual press conference. So, Mr. Dunham, let's talk about Russia-US ties, which is at a historical low since the Cold War ended. And talking about this so-called Russia Gate, President Putin said some US politicians invented this whole thing. Do you think that's the case?
Definitely not. I mean, that's my opinion as an American journalist and watching the evidence. There's overwhelming evidence of Russian interference, of everything from hacking into computers to test to see if they could influence the election returns, but specifically using social media, I think brilliantly, to help Donald Trump in the election. But going back to Putin and the press conference, what was interesting to me is last year he was much more critical, much more talking about fake news. This year the tone was almost more dismissive of it. It's going to be a big issue in the United States the next year. There are going to be further indictments, and Donald Trump is going to be at the center of it. But I think Russia wants to move beyond that. I mean, with what Putin said at the press conference, that energy prices have done more damage to the Russian economy than the sanctions, which are a result of the interference in the election. I think he was sort of signaling to try to avoid this issue, to put it in the past as best he can, and not to inflame the issue with the U.S. Congress. Because in Congress, Republicans, even more than Democrats, are mad at Russia. They go back to the old Cold War mentality, Republicans being anti-communist. So he needs to make sure that he keeps Donald Trump as friendly as possible toward him, but he doesn't want to inflame the situation in the U.S. anymore.
Having said that, Mr. Cui, President Putin still hinted that it may be possible for the U.S. and Russia to cooperate on some hot global issues like the DPRK. Do you think that is going to happen? Because, for example, on the Syria issue, we don't see that happen a lot.
Yes, I think that for these relations between Russia and the U.S., so far we can find out a very, very complicated situation. I think on one level, especially a personal level, I believe that still those two leaders, they have a personal, good feelings with each other. We can even find out this, after the press conference, Mr. Trump got a telephone conversation with Mr. Putin immediately. We can find that for both leaders, yes, there are some possibility to get better relations between two countries. But now I think the big question is how is the interruption of domestic politics of Russia, of the United States against this foreign policy from Trump administration. But I think, of course, once there are some bigger problem on the bilateral levels, if we find out some kind of structural problems between two countries. But still, I think that those regional and global issue will give some space for both two countries to look for some common grounds, especially once there are some crisis happened. What happened, for example, of DPRK or some other regional issues.
What about Europe? That's your area of expertise.
Yes.
It's for sure that Russia is facing unprecedented political and military pressure on its borders with Eastern European countries due to NATO's eastward enlargement program. How serious is the situation? Do you think something out of control will happen?
I think that so far the main problem is still between Russia and the United States, not between Russia and Europe. But of course, I think European countries, they have their own interests, especially on some, also the Ukrainian issue and also some other, political issue. But so far, I think that still there are more and more possibility for kind of, how to say, a good environment for both two sides. Because so far we can find out they are very, very different, definition from various European countries on so-called what's Russia's threat. Even for most of European countries, I don't think they regard Russia as a main enemy. Still, they regarded Russia as a partner, even it's maybe a troublesome partner.
So, Mr. Dunham, these troubled or strained ties between US and Russia have caused much repercussions in many global arenas. For example, even sports. What about the upcoming World Cup in Russia and Winter Olympics? The whole Russia team was banned from participate in Winter Olympics.
Let's start with the Winter Olympics, because that was one of those things at the press conference. President Putin blamed the American FBI and American intelligence for setting up his team. He will send, Russians will go, but they will not be allowed to compete. But he blamed U.S. intelligence for turning one of the members of the Russian doping agency against them. That is an issue. But I don't think it will affect the World Cup. World Cup will be there. There's a cloud over Russian athletics, but I think it is what it is. I think when you look at U.S. and Russia, I think it bottomed out at the end of the Obama presidency. I actually do think, like my colleague, that the personal relationship, the good relationship between President Putin and President Trump has helped stabilize the situation. And I think in Syria, it was an example where President Trump gave the green light to the Russians to do what they did. And looking ahead, I think in Korea it could be very important. China already is playing a positive role working with the United States, and if Russia gets involved, I think it could be very important. I think on the other side, we have to worry about Iran, because Russia is very close to Iran. Iran is on the Shia side of the Sunni-Shia divide. Trump is very, very close to the Saudi crown prince, and that's where there's potential trouble, and I hope that a good personal relationship could help ease that situation.
Well, for more insight into this press conference, let's talk to Mr. Fred Weir, a political analyst based in Russia. So, Mr. Weir, do you think it's a legacy-setting time for Mr. Putin?
Well, he is now almost certain to win an absolutely unprecedented fourth term of office. It'll be a 6-year term, so I think this is definite that we are going to have this all-powerful Putin running Russia for the next 6 years. However, Under the Russian Constitution, he is not entitled to more than 2 consecutive terms. He dodged that before by giving his Prime Minister, Dmitry Medvedev, 4 years in office. Then they changed the Constitution when Putin came back. But when he finishes this 6-year term, he will be 72 years old. If he steps aside for a placeholder for 6 years, he'll be 78. So I think there's reason to believe that this 6 years will be his last term in office, at least in this guise as the all-powerful president. There's a lot of talk in Moscow that Putin did not discuss it in his press conference yesterday. There's a lot of talk about changes to the Constitution, maybe in the style of what's happening in Kazakhstan next door right now, which would perhaps devolve power downward to the parliament, make Putin a more remote but permanent fixture at the top as head of state of Russia. But all that remains to be seen. He has to reform the system in a lot of different ways. He doesn't seem to be able to leave, and Russians are so used to him by now that it would be really jarring and perhaps even catastrophic for him to leave. So something will happen, probably early in his next term.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fred Weir in Moscow. So, gentlemen, talking about Russian domestic politics, Mr. Tsui, why do you think the Russian opposition is getting weaker and weaker?
I think, firstly, we should say that Mr. Putin, as a president, did a good job in the last, even decades. And also, I think that another reason is so far we cannot find out competitive, challengers from opposition packed to Mr. Putin. And even for his own, party, we can also could not find out a very, very, qualified, successor like that. I think that also give a very big question to Russian politics, which means that how about the situation after Mr. Putin?
So how about the situation after Mr. Putin, Mr. Dunham?
Well, there is no obvious successor, and that is one situation where you've had strong men in a lot of the rest of the world. What happens after? You have it in Belarus, you have it in Kazakhstan, you're going to see it in Russia. What happens? Obviously there's no family dynasty like in North Korea.
Do you think Mr. Putin's announcement to run for the next presidential election as an independent candidate adds more to that mystery?
Yes, it does, because think about the comparisons. In China, Xi Jinping and the Communist Party are one and the same. In the United States, Donald Trump is the face of the Republican Party now, which has not been good for the Republican Party. In China, it is the face of one man. In Russia, the face of one man, Vladimir Putin. And it does give him great flexibility in trying to determine, not only to govern for the next 6 years, but to determine his successor, because he doesn't have to go through a party. It's not who is the prime person of that party. But I do think the idea of grooming a successor will be important. Stability is so important. Look at what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and a decade of political anarchy and economic oligarchy that set Russia back decades. So I think it will be important for him to figure out what to do after him. It's not only the country's future, but it's his legacy that depends on it.
Now let's get back to the very format of this marathon press conference itself. Mr. Tsui, at the beginning of this program, you described the event is getting more and more unattractive. So do you think if Mr. Putin wins another term, we're going to see 5 or 6 more such press conferences?
I think it's also firstly depends on how is the energy for Mr. Putin. Right? I think that once it's a marathon press conference, I think it become one of the highlights for this press conference is how could Mr. Putin collect himself and to deal with any difficult questions Another, I think, the question is, how about Russia in another 4 or 5 years? Which means for strategy or for economy and for politics, if Russia could keep itself in the highlights of the international arena, I think it's a decisive reason if we can find a more interest to keep observation, keep concern about Mr. Putin and his press conference.
Well, Mr. Dunham, how important is such a format in political image building and political communication?
I think it's very important. I think this is one of the things he does that is most effective. He takes every question from everyone. Some tough questions, some negative questions. Yes, the rules are rigged a little. You can't follow up, so he can avoid questions if he wants. But he shows his stamina. He shows his toughness in this, and I think that works for him. And I think he would continue to do it. Again, I look in comparison to the United States, where I covered the White House for 17 years. Donald Trump has had only one wide-open press conference since he's been president. It really is good for the public to get this kind of accountability, where you have a wide range of questions on serious topics and on topics of visiting with young people in the provinces. And I think that's good. It's
so
good to
it
have that
somehow also
accountability.
shows a particular leader's political competence.
Exactly.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for our input. And that's it for this edition of Dialogue on CGTN. I'm Pan Dong in Beijing. Bye-bye. Thank you.